The thing moved alongside us for 3 miles. We could hear it keeping pace in the dark between the ties. When we stopped, it stopped. When the locomotive started again, so did it. None of us spoke about it until morning, and by then, we'd all decided we hadn't heard anything at all. That entry appears in the work log of the Central Pacific Railroad, dated November 14th, 1873. It was written by a night foreman named William Dutch, a man known among his crew for brevity and an absence of imagination. The line was crossed out the following day. Beneath it, in different handwriting, someone had written, "Disregard above, equipment malfunction." But the crossing out was thin. You could still read every word underneath. William Dutch left the railroad 3 weeks later. The company records list no reason for his departure. His name appears in the Sacramento boarding house registry through the winter of 1874, and then it disappears entirely from public record. He was 32 years old. The railroad continued west. In 1873, the Transcontinental Railroad had been complete for 4 years, but the work was far from over. Secondary lines were being laid across Nevada and eastern California, reaching into territories that had, until recently, seemed more wagon ruts than human settlement. These were not the grand routes that connected oceans. These were the veins, thin, unheralded, and often temporary, that fed ore, timber, and livestock toward the larger junctions. The crews were small, 20 to 30 men at a time, working in rotations. They lived in converted boxcars that sat on sidings, moving every few weeks as the rails extended. The landscape around them was sparse and severe. Alkaline flats, low scrub, distant ridges of purple stone that seemed to retreat as you approached them. Water was scarce. Wood for ties had to be hauled from 60 miles south. At night, the darkness was absolute. Most of the men were Irish or Chinese, with a scattering of former soldiers and drifters. They were paid by the mile. The work was repetitive and cruel. Lifting iron, driving spikes, leveling ballast under a sun that never seemed to move. They spoke little. Conversations, when they happened, were pragmatic about food, about pay, about the condition of the rails behind them. There were no towns nearby. The nearest settlement of any size was a mining camp called Mineral Wells, 2 days' ride north. A supply wagon came every 10 days, weather permitting. Mail came less often. If a man was injured, he was taken back along the completed track to the nearest junction, sometimes a journey of 40 miles. If he died, he was buried alongside the grade in shallow earth marked by stones. The railroad did not stop. The stretch of line being laid that autumn ran parallel to an older route, a remnant of a freight road used during the silver rushes of the 1860s. The road had been abandoned for years. What structures remained along it were collapsed or gutted by wind. Stations that had once sold water and fodder were now just stains in the dirt, their timbers carried off or burned. The land had a used quality, as though something had passed through and decided not to return. It was country that swallowed sound. Men noticed this. A shout carried only a short distance before it seemed to fold back into the air. The wind, when it came, was oddly directionless. You could feel it on your face, but see nothing move. At night, the silence was so complete that the crews grew accustomed to the small noises of their own bodies. The creak of a jaw, the pop of a knuckle, sounds that would have gone unnoticed elsewhere. The foreman, William Dutch, had been with the Central Pacific for 6 years. He'd worked the Sierra grades during the winter of 1867, a season that killed 12 men in his crew alone. He was not easily shaken. His logs were terse and professional. He recorded mileage, materials used, delays caused by weather or equipment. He did not editorialize. But in the autumn of 1873, his entries began to change. The first mentions were unremarkable. October 9th. Crew reports hearing the animal near the grade after dark. No visual confirmation. Likely coyote. October 12th. Night watch reports movement along the cut south of camp. Investigated at first light. No tracks observed. October 18th. Men refused night work on eastern section. Claim poor visibility. 2 hours. It was a refusal that stood out. The crews were not prone to complaint. They worked in conditions that would have been unthinkable to men in cities. Heat that blistered skin through shirts, cold that turned sweat to ice in minutes. They did not refuse work lightly. When questioned, the men were vague. They had heard something. Not an animal. Not the wind. Something that moved with intention. One of the Chinese laborers, a man named Lao Chun who spoke little English, tried to explain it to the cook. He made a gesture with his hands, something low to the ground, moving in a stuttering rhythm. The cook, an older man from Kansas named Albert Kern, wrote about it in a letter to his sister in Topeka. The Chinaman was trying to tell me something about the night before, but I couldn't make heads or tails of it. He kept saying, not dog, and moving his hands like he was showing me something crawling. I told him it was probably just a badger or some such, but he shook his head and wouldn't go back to work on that section for the rest of the day. The letter is dated October 21st, 1873. It is part of a collection held by the Kansas Historical Society. Albert Kern mailed it from a relay station 40 miles west. By the time his sister received it in early November, Albert had stopped writing. The sounds began to be reported more frequently. Men working the late shift, laying ties ahead of the next day's rail placement, said they heard something moving parallel to them in the dark. It stayed just beyond the range of their lanterns, 30 or 40 feet out. When they stopped to listen, it stopped. When they resumed, it resumed. A rail setter named Patrick Morrissey described it to William Dutch as a sliding sort of sound, like something being dragged but with a beat to it. He said it reminded him of a wounded horse trying to walk, but slower, heavier. Dutch told him it was the wind moving loose ballast. Morrissey didn't argue, but he requested a transfer to the day crew. Dutch granted it. By the end of October, nearly a third of the crew had asked to be reassigned away from night work. This created a problem. The schedule required round-the-clock progress. Delays meant penalties from the company. Dutch began offering extra pay for night shifts, $1 more per day. Some men took it. Others refused outright. On the night of November 2nd, 2 men were working a quarter mile ahead of camp, setting grade stakes for the following day's pour. Their names were Emil Torvald and a man recorded only as Jessup. No first name given. They carried a single lantern between them and a mallet for driving the stakes. Jessup returned to camp alone just after midnight. He was walking quickly, but not running. His face, according to Albert Kern, was pale as tallow. He went directly to his boxcar berth and did not speak to anyone. Emil Torvald came back 20 minutes later. He told Dutch that they had heard something moving in the cut below the grade, something large enough to displace gravel. He said it had followed them for 15 minutes, staying just out of sight. When they stopped to confront it, there was nothing. When they continued, it started again. Dutch asked if he'd seen anything. Torvald said no. Dutch asked if it could have been one of the other men playing a prank. Torvald said the sound was too heavy. He said it reminded him of something he'd heard once in Minnesota, when a man had been dragged behind a horse through underbrush. That specific quality of weight and resistance. Dutch wrote in his log, crew spooked by wildlife. Morale low. Recommended increased lighting on forward sections. But 3 days later, he crossed it out and wrote, disregard. The company sent a supervisor in mid-November. His name was Thomas Greer, a man from the Sacramento office who had spent most of his career managing depot logistics. He arrived on a company handcar with an assistant and a ledger, intending to assess why progress had slowed. He stayed for 4 days. On the first night, he ate with the crew in the dining car and asked questions about morale and equipment. The men were polite but quiet. Greer noted in his report that the camp seemed unusually subdued for a crew of its size. He attributed this to isolation and the lateness of the season. On the second night, Greer accompanied William Dutch on inspection of the forward grade. They walked the line by lantern light, checking the placement of the previous day's rails. It was a clear night, cold enough that their breath hung in the air. The land around them was invisible beyond the small circle of light they carried. Halfway through the inspection, Greer stopped. He later wrote that he had heard something to the south of the line, a rhythmic sound, like metal scraping over stone. He asked Dutch if there were any men working in that direction. Dutch said no. Greer called out. No one answered. They stood for several minutes, listening. The sound continued, faint but steady. Greer wanted to investigate. Dutch suggested they return to camp and send a larger group in the morning. Greer agreed. In his report, filed on November 19th, Greer wrote, "The men are experiencing auditory phenomena, likely caused by wind interacting with the surrounding terrain. The cuts and grades create unusual acoustic effects. I observed this myself on the night of the 16th. While unsettling, it poses no direct threat to operations. Recommend continued work and discouragement of superstitious speculation among the laborers." He left the following morning. He did not return. The nights grew longer. The crew worked in shorter shifts, and even the men who had accepted extra pay for night work began to falter. Conversations in the dining car became hushed and brief. Men ate quickly and returned to their berths. The Chinese laborers began sleeping in groups, pulling their cots together in the corners of their boxcar. When asked why, one of them said, through broken English, that it was safer to be heard. No one asked what he meant by that. On November 11th, a rail inspector named Howard Lassiter was walking the completed line behind the camp, checking for frost heave in the ballast. It was late afternoon, the sun already low and orange. He was alone. He returned an hour later and went directly to Dutch's quarters. Albert Kern, who was passing by with pot coffee, heard part of the conversation through the door. He wrote about it in his next letter home. Lassiter was saying he'd seen something on the tracks about a mile back. He kept saying it wasn't right, that it didn't move the way it should. Dutch asked him what it was, and Lassiter said he didn't know. He said it looked like it had been lying across the rails, but when he got closer, it pulled itself off into the brush. He said it moved wrong. That's the word he kept using. Wrong. Dutch ordered the section re-inspected the following morning. 3 men walked the line in full daylight. They found nothing, no tracks, no disturbance in the ballast, no sign that anything had been on the rails. Lassiter was reassigned to work closer to camp. He did not protest. The thing, whatever it was, grew bolder. By mid-November, it was no longer just a sound in the distance. Men reported seeing movement at the edge of their lantern light. Shadows that shifted when they shouldn't. Shapes that seemed to crouch low against a grade, then vanish when the light swung toward them. A teamster named Samuel Pickett claimed he saw it clearly one night while tending to the horses. He said it was pressed against the side of a boxcar about 30 feet from where he stood. He described it as long and low, like a man crawling, but not shaped right. He said it stayed there for several seconds, unmoving, before sliding backward into the dark. When Dutch asked him why he hadn't raised an alarm, Pickett said he hadn't been sure what he was seeing. He said it looked almost like a person, but the proportions were wrong. The arms too long. The way it moved too smooth. Dutch told him to keep quiet about it. Pickett agreed, but by the next day, the entire camp knew. On the night of November 14th, Dutch was supervising a late rail placement with a crew of 8 men. The work was nearly finished. Just a final section of track to be spiked down and tamped. The night was still and moonless. They worked by the light of 4 lanterns spaced along the grade. It was one of the Chinese laborers who noticed it first. He stopped mid-swing and turned toward the north side of the grade. The others paused, following his gaze. At first, they saw nothing. Then they heard it. The sound was close. Closer than it had ever been. A dragging, rhythmic scrape, moving parallel to them along the base of the grade. It matched their pace exactly. Dutch ordered the men to stop working. They stood in silence, listening. The sound continued for a moment, then stopped. One of the men, a younger Irish laborer named Coyle, picked up a lantern and walked toward the edge of the grade. Dutch told him to stay put. Coyle ignored him. He held the lantern out over the slope, leaning forward to see into the darkness below. He froze. Later, he would say he'd seen something looking back at him. Not eyes. He was very specific about that. He said there were no eyes. But something had been there, just at the limit of the light, and it had been aware of him. He said he could feel it watching. Not with sight, but with attention. He stepped back. The lantern in his hand was shaking. Dutch called the crew back to camp. They left the tools where they lay. No one spoke during the walk back. The sound followed them for the first 100 yards, then stopped. In his log that night, Dutch wrote the entry that would be crossed out the next day. The thing moved alongside us for 3 miles. We could hear it keeping pace in the dark between the ties. When we stopped, it stopped. When the locomotive started again, so did it. None of us spoke about it until morning, and by then, we'd all decided we hadn't heard anything at all. Beneath it, in the morning, someone else had written, "Disregard above. Equipment malfunction." But the crossing out was thin. You could still read every word. The camp began to fracture after that night. 3 men left without notice on November 16th. They took no pay, no final wages. They simply walked east along completed track until they were out of sight. Dutch sent a rider after them, but the rider returned alone. He said he'd found them 6 miles down the line, still walking. When he'd called out, they hadn't turned around. The remaining crew grew quiet and watchful. Men stopped working in pairs. They stayed in groups of 4 or more, even during the day. At night, the camp contracted. Lanterns were left burning in every boxcar. The cook kept the fire going until dawn, and men would sit near it in silence, staring into the flames. Dutch tried to maintain order, but his authority was eroding. The company wired instructions to continue work. Dutch wired back, requesting additional men and better lighting. The company responded that shipments were delayed due to weather and that the crew should make do with existing resources. On November 20th, the locomotive engineer, a man named Voss, refused to run the train after dark. He said he'd seen something on the tracks 2 nights prior while moving a string of empty flat cars to the forward position. He said it had been lying across the rails about a 1/4 mile ahead, and when he'd applied the brakes, it had moved. Not quickly, slowly, deliberately. It had pulled itself off the tracks and into the brush beside the grade, but it hadn't hurried. Voss said that was what disturbed him most. It had moved as though it knew the train couldn't reach it in time, as though it had been waiting. Dutch asked him what it looked like. Voss said he couldn't be sure. The headlamp had caught it for only a few seconds. He said it was long, maybe 10 or 12 feet, and low to the ground. He said it looked damaged or incomplete, like something that had been taken apart and put back together wrong. He refused to say more. The train did not run after dark for the next week. On the night of November 23rd, a fight broke out in the dining car. It started over something small, an accusation that one man had taken another's tobacco. But it escalated quickly. Voices were raised. A table was overturned. Dutch intervened, separating the men, but the tension remained. One of them, a laborer named Quinn, shouted that he was tired of pretending, that everyone knew something was out there, that the company was sending them out to die. Dutch ordered him to his quarters. Quinn refused. He said he'd seen himself 3 nights ago, standing between 2 of the boxcars. He said it had been taller than a man when it stood upright, but it hadn't stood like a man. It had unfolded, he said, like something that had been crouching, suddenly deciding to rise. The room went silent. Dutch told him to stop talking. Quinn ignored him. He said others had seen it too, and they were cowards for not admitting it. He pointed to Coyle, to Lassiter, to 2 of the Chinese laborers. He said they all knew. No one responded. Quinn left the dining car and walked into the dark. He did not return. A search was organized at first light. They found his cap near the grade, about half a mile from camp. There were no footprints, no signs of struggle. The cap was sitting upright on a railroad tie, as though it had been placed there carefully. They did not find Quinn. The company suspended operations on November 27th. The official reason given was weather. Early snow in the mountain passes had delayed supply shipments, and the crew could not continue without materials. The men were to return to the nearest junction and await reassignment. Dutch supervised the dismantling of the camp. The boxcars were hitched to the locomotive and pulled back along the completed track. Tools were loaded. Supplies were inventoried. The work was done in silence. On the final night, Dutch walked the grade alone. He carried a lantern and a notebook. He wanted to see the forward section one last time, to record the exact point where they had stopped. He walked for 20 minutes, following the rails into the dark. The lantern light swung in small arcs, illuminating the gravel and ties. The land around him was invisible. He reached the end of the completed track and stopped. Ahead of him, the grade continued, cleared and leveled, but without rails. It stretched into the darkness like a pale scar. He stood there for a long time listening, and then he heard it. The sound was faint but unmistakable. A slow, dragging scrape moving along the grade ahead of him. It was coming closer. Dutch raised the lantern. The light reached perhaps 30 feet. Beyond that, there was only darkness. The sound continued. Steady, rhythmic, patient. Dutch took a step backward. Then another. The sound stopped. He waited motionless. His breath was shallow. The lantern trembled in his hand. And then, from the darkness ahead, there came a different sound. A low, wet exhalation. Not wind. Not animal. Something breathing. Dutch turned and walked back to camp. He did not run. He moved steadily, deliberately, his eyes fixed on the distant glow of the fire. He did not look back. The sound did not follow him, but he could feel it there, behind him in the dark, watching him leave. The crew was evacuated on November 28, 1873. The locomotive pulled the remaining boxcars east of the junction at Silver Ridge, a 2-day journey. Dutch submitted his final report on December 2nd. It was 3 pages long, detailing mileage completed, materials used, and the condition of the grade. There was no mention of Quinn, no mention of the sounds, the sightings, or the men who had left. The report was filed and approved. William Dutch resigned on December 8th. He provided no explanation. The company offered him a position on a line being built in southern Arizona. He declined. He took a room in Sacramento and, according to city records, worked briefly as a freight clerk at a grain warehouse. By the spring of 1874, his name disappears from all records. There is no death certificate, no further employment, no correspondence. He was 32 years old. The railroad resumed work on the Nevada grade in March of 1874, with a new crew and a new foreman. Progress was swift. The section that had taken Dutch's crew 3 months to lay was completed in 6 weeks. There were no delays, no reports of unusual occurrences, but the route was altered. The original grade, the one Dutch's crew had been working, was abandoned. A new path was surveyed 2 miles to the north. The official reason given was geological instability in the original route. Bedrock had been found to be unsuitable for long-term support. No evidence of geological surveys exists in the company's records. The abandoned grade remained. For a time, local ranchers used it as a livestock path. But within a few years, they stopped. When asked why, one rancher told a newspaper reporter in 1881 that the animals refused to walk it after dark. He said his cattle would balk at the entrance to the cut no matter how hard they were driven. He said it wasn't worth the trouble. By 1890, the grade was overgrown and impassable. There are fragments. A letter from Albert Kern to his sister, dated December 1873, mentions that he is leaving railroad work. He writes, "I have seen enough of this country. There are places men are not meant to lay track." He returned to Kansas and worked as a store clerk until his death in 1902. In his belongings, his family found a small journal, Most of it detailed mundane aspects of camp life: meals, weather, minor injuries. But one entry, dated November 15th, 1873, simply reads, "It was at the edge of the lantern light again last night, closer than before. I think it's learning." The journal is held by the Kansas Historical Society. The entry is unaccompanied by any explanation. A report filed by Thomas Greer, the company supervisor, remains in the Central Pacific Archives. Most of it is procedural: assessment of crew efficiency, materials costs, projected timelines. But near the end, there is a single paragraph that was later struck through with black ink. I must note an unusual atmospheric quality to the forward sections of the grade. The men's reports of auditory disturbances cannot be entirely dismissed as superstition. I myself experienced a profound sense of unease during my inspection on the night of November 16th. While I remain confident that these sensations have rational explanations, I would recommend that future work in this region be conducted with an increased complement of men and improved illumination. Below the paragraph, in the margin, someone had written in pencil, "Not for inclusion." Harold Voss, the locomotive engineer, transferred to a line in Northern California in early 1874. He worked there for 6 years without incident. In 1880, he was interviewed by a railroad historian compiling records of early Western lines. When asked about his time on the Nevada grade, Voss was brief. "There was a section we laid in 73 that didn't take. Bad ground. The company rerouted. That's all there is to it." The historian pressed him, mentioning rumors of unusual occurrences. Voss ended the interview. But in his personal effects, found after his death in 1903, there was a photograph. It showed a stretch of railroad track disappearing into the distance. On the back, in Voss's handwriting, was a single line: "November 1873, the last night we ran the locomotive after dark." The photograph is underexposed. The track is visible, but the area around it is nearly black. At the very edge of the frame, where the light fades, there is a shape. It is indistinct, too blurred to identify clearly, but it is low to the ground, and it is long, and it appears to be lying across the rails. The photograph is held by the California State Railroad Museum. It has never been displayed. The stretch of abandoned grade still exists, though few people know where to find it. It lies roughly 18 miles south of what is now State Route 361, in a region of northwestern Nevada that sees little traffic. The landscape has changed remarkably little since 1873. The same alkaline flats, the same distant ridges of purple stone. If you know where to look, you can still see the cuts in the earth where the grade was meant to run. The gravel is mostly gone, scattered by wind and time, but the shape remains, a scar that never fully healed. Local ranchers still avoid it, though most couldn't tell you why. Old habits passed down. The kind of knowledge that doesn't require explanation. There are no markers, no plaques. The railroad does not acknowledge the site in any official history. The maps from 1873 show the planned route, but the maps from 1875 show the revision. The gap between them is 2 miles in 2 years, and in that gap, something happened that no one wanted to write down in full. William Dutch never spoke of it. As far as we know, the men who left the camp never came forward. Quinn was never found. The thing that moved along the tracks, if it was a thing at all, was never identified, never captured, never explained. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part. Not that something was there, but that so many men saw it, heard it, felt it, and every one of them chose silence over testimony, chose to walk away, to cross out the words, to let the record go incomplete, because some things once written down become harder to forget, and some places, once laid with iron and intention, remain touched by whatever noticed the intrusion. The rails were pulled up, the grade was abandoned, the route was changed. But on certain nights when the wind is still and the air is cold, there are people who live near that stretch of country who say they hear it. A rhythmic scraping sound, distant and low, moving along a path that no longer exists. They do not investigate. They close their windows, and they wait for morning. And in the morning, when they drive past that empty land, they do not look too closely at the ground, because sometimes in the pale dirt where the grade used to run, there are marks, long, deep furrows, as though something heavy had dragged itself from one end to the other. The marks are always gone by afternoon, but they return,